actually spending time with it. So Gershwin, he actually was, you know, he would sat in the parlors where the great Harlem pianists were playing. And he made himself part of that community. He also made himself part of the community of really innovative classical composers. He also was definitely part of this community of people who were all white at the time, who were churning out popular songs that were suddenly marketable on a level that couldn't have been true a decade or two before. And he was also part of a community that had access to Eastern European things, to what we might call klezmer music, to cantorial music. And the truth is, when you look deeply, richly into musical histories, there are a lot of connections of all these things. And it is, I find it sometimes odd that people don't look to sources. Like if you were to go online in the Wall Street Journal today, I have a review out by the pianist Randy Weston, who I think is one of our great living musicians in the United States. Yet I find that my colleagues, so Randy Weston lived in Morocco for a while, he's worked and researched extensively into African music. He's really, I played a little bit of Thelonious Monk, and one thing that's true about Thelonious Monk is that his approach to the piano, the way he held his fingers on the keys, created a sound that was more African than another pianist might make. And Randy Weston has really tried to extend that idea and that sound. And I find that a lot of my colleagues think it's almost like an affectation, or they think like, oh, Randy Weston is mixing jazz with world music. It's like, no, he's looking to a source of information that was there before the monk was there. And, you know, so I do find it odd that, yeah, like you said, sometimes willing ignorance or even erasure of the history or the sources is a dangerous thing. But then there's also this very complicated thing. Like, we probably all had the experience where, like, maybe Cubans are playing something that's based in African music, but then 20 years, 30 years later, the Cubans bring that music to Africa, and the Africans are gaga over it because they'd forgotten about this thing that they really started, or it fell out of favor. And I know a lot of the cultural appropriation that you were talking about, Melvin, relates to Porgy and Bess, where Gershwin spent time in Charleston, he spent time on James Island, he was around the Gullah people, he was around Charleston, black community. So I was thinking this past week, is there something new we could say about Porgy and Bess? It's a very complex relationship there, because he's got song titles that might sound like it's caricaturing the way that a person spoke. Then again, he passed up a Met Opera commission because he demanded that it be an all-black cast. So I was thinking, is there anything new we could say here about Porgy and Bess? And voila, there's an article in the New York Times last week. The Hungarian State Opera's new staging of the Gershwin opera Porgy and Bess is raising eyebrows here and abroad. The production features a predominantly white cast in a work whose authors intended it to be staged by black performers. The landmark opera, based on a novel, a subsequent play, is set in the fictional African-American community of Catfish Row in Charleston, South Carolina. The love story of a beggar with his disability and a drug-addicted woman in an impoverished community struggling with violence and racism. In the new production in Budapest, the action has been transplanted to a refugee camp in an airplane hangar at an unspecified time and place. So there it gets even more complicated, because now we're eliminating the blackness from something that intentionally had blackness in it, that was controversial from the beginning. So I mean, do you think that Gershwin was simply taking from a culture?
Well, before I answer that, I wanted to kind of tag on to something that Russ said earlier about this idea of playing going to Alice Opera and playing the music for the audience, and the audience hearing new possibilities from the fact that he did that. I mean, when you talk about Gershwin, you have to you have to say It's not even admit, it's a fact that what he did created a new set of possibilities for the next set of people that came after. That's just facts.
Right.
You know. But it's interesting when you talk about this and talking about the time he existed, what popped into my head was Picasso and Alfredo Lab. You're thinking about these, and thinking about in the context of this Hungarian thing. There's two levels here. These guys were, I'll leave Alfredo out. Picasso was directly created his style from looking at African art. There's so many levels of that. We know when you look at let's say Benin bronze, you know it's a masterful piece of artwork, but it's called a Benin bronze. You don't know who did it.
Right.
You know, it's like for whatever reason, there's no actual. It's framed as it's owned by the community. But there was a person who spent his whole life learning how to do that. We don't know who that person is. We know who Picasso is. And we know he's French. You know, so there's this sort of thing within the context of Western culture that's based off of individualism. The individual gets lost. And the other side of that is, I have a good friend, I'm not gonna name drop something. He had this epiphany when he went to Benin, and he was in Benin for a couple of weeks, and he was looking at the Benin art. And he called me from Benin, which was actually quite expensive at that time. This is before the euro, so. He called me and he said, I realized something. These things that we think are abstract art, that's what people in Benin look like. You know? Yeah. So to bring it back to what you were talking about Gershwin, I mean, yes, the African American experience, not in the Seattle, because they didn't have, that's a whole nother 2-hour talk. But refugee is not that far from the truth of African American experience. So why erase it? It's kind of like there should be a way to build on it instead of remove it. And that's where it becomes problematic, because you have this thing that adds to the culture and also subtracts from the culture at the same time.
There's something I was thinking about. Gershwin as a Jew in 1920 or 1925 was a part of an outsider culture, even though a big one in New York. So I was thinking about Porgy and Bess and how he must have been thinking about that story and how he could relate to it emotionally. Is that being a Jew whose parents immigrated and were escaping oppression in Europe. There's some element of that must have connected with him in terms of trying to understand how it would feel to be an African American living under those conditions. I figure he must have, Jews are more, obviously can become assimilated into white American culture in a different way for obvious reasons. But especially as immigrant Jews at that time, that feeling of being part of an oppressed minority that was not allowed certain things, even though Gershwin himself did quite well, must have figured into his emotional universe he was trying to set up or try to understand it. That refugee idea that you mentioned, it's setting up sort of metaphor for himself to understand, to try to get inside those characters.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point, and I think that's probably on some level close to the truth of what analogy he would have come up with. I mean, I was saying to Larry on the way up here, I mean, one thing I have in common with Gershwin is I'm from Brooklyn, right? And I'm from the integration generation. My family was the second African American family on our block. And we were talking about Bernie Sanders, about the fact that Bernie Sanders to me is an archetype. I know that person well.
And I was saying that he's my Uncle Myra.
And my aunt was his class president in 8th grade.
In Brooklyn. But in the meantime, I've met people's grandmothers with numbers tattooed on their arms. You know, I mean, there's a real commonality there. I think that, but where it becomes problematic is, okay, somebody gets to walk in the door and somebody has to stand outside, and how is that being navigated? You know?
And it's worth noting that James P. Johnson did not have the career opportunities that George Gershwin had in that moment. Not in defense of Gershwin, but as an observation, I will note that, you know, Gershwin, in the true great subversive nature of most good American culture, definitely African American culture, Gershwin, you know, when he wanted to create an opera out of this material, he went to the sources, he tried to honor it the way that he thought was artistically correct, and when the Met came to him with something lucrative, and then Al Jolson came to him about doing it in blackface, he said no, and he wanted to present it with an African American cast, which at the time was a risky proposition. And then when Paul Whiteman came to him and said, I want to make a lady out of jazz, what he really asked for was more of a symphonic look. And what Gershwin gave him was more the kind of work that a piano player and a jazz musician would make with symphonic elements.
It's sort of a piano concerto.
It is, but it's not even a piano concerto because it doesn't have that kind of integrity of a concerto. It's more and in a way, he sort of opened the door for more acceptance of what a jazz musician would do with those opportunities. Now, I'm not saying that he did that for benevolent reasons, but he did do those things. I do want to leave some time for questions. I also, you know, I remember that in 1998, when it was the Gershwin Centennial, I was editing a magazine and we did like a Gershwin issue. So I won't read a long quote from Gershwin's 1933, The Composer of the Machine Age. But in 1933, he wrote, "Jazz is the result of the energy stored up in America." And he wrote, "The only kinds of music which endure are those which possess form in the universal sense and folk music." And I think both of those statements are useful today, but I find them surprising in 1933. And then Herbie Hancock had come up with an album that year, Gershwin's World. And I think Herbie was kind of talking a long time with the lines you are, Melvin, but I think maybe he was, in Herbie's fashion, being a little diplomatic about it. But he said, one of the things he said about Gershwin was he had not only respect for jazz music, and by that I take it he means African American culture, but it touched him in a way that helped make possible the Gershwin that we know, which was, I think, Herbie's way of saying, no black music, no Gershwin. The same way that Miles Davis said, no drummer, no rhythm, no music.
Last night I listened to, I hunted up on YouTube, the first recording of Porgy and Bess, the oldest recording, the original cast recording. And just to see how it would strike me, I haven't listened to a version of Porgy and Bess in a long time. Along with the things that I thought I would hear, which was like, you know, blues feeling and like stride piano syncopation, I heard a lot of Stravinsky. I heard like Italian opera artist Verdi, Puccini sounds. It was like, it struck me as a true fusion. It was like he really felt, you know, all of that music and put it together in an interesting way. Like there was moments where it felt like stride piano syncopation in the orchestra. I guess I'm conflating this also. I listened to Rhapsody in Blue and American in Paris, all the original recordings, like the first recordings. And some of the time, if I'm going, man, that's pure stride piano, and then a second later, it's like, that's Stravinsky. And he somehow managed to like be both of those things at the same time. And I think that's the most interesting kind of cultural fusion, as someone who immerses himself as deeply as one can in multiple traditions and tries to be honest about, you know, doing something with it.
Well, that's true, and yet I'd rather hear Ledger Hymns.
Can we have both?
Yeah, we can. Do we have questions? Or
Yeah.
Cool.
Hi, I'm Richard Schneider, political science professor and faculty fellow at the Watson Institute, and I was tasked with moderating the Q&A. Before I open it up, I just want to recognize Kathleen Pletcher, the executive director of FirstWorks, who's with us, and also my colleague Stefan Alexander, who is the co-director of the Presidential Scholars Program here at Brown. Also a jazz saxophonist, and thank you for your support of this event. So I think what makes best sense, given that we're tight on time, is to collect, say, 3 or 4 questions and then let the panelists respond. So let's open it up. Are there questions for the panel from anybody? Glenn Lowry, colleague from economics in the Watson Institute. Glenn?
Yeah, so on the cultural appropriation question, I'm thinking, I mean, we live in the age of people building walls, not wanting foreigners to come into their country, not just here in the United States, but in a lot of places. And I'm wondering if there isn't a useful analogy in the cultural realm to this idea that openness and a kind of seeking, not presuming that we're going to get there tomorrow, of a commonality in our humanity, isn't just the way. That's just, I'm wondering if isn't anything to that idea. Now, who gets credit? Who gets paid?
Who makes the money, yeah.
I'm not saying that's irrelevant, okay? But the idea that you build a wall, you know, I'm not accusing anybody of anything, I'm just trying to put something on the table. It just look like for writing. I'm an economist, I went to graduate school at MIT in the 1970s. All my teachers were Jewish. Franco Modigliani, Paul Samuelson, Robert Solow, Peter Diamond, Marty Weitzman, Stanley Fisher. Was that Jewish science going on at MIT? You know, so I'm made to feel a little bit uneasy when we try to appropriate to the, you know, something about authenticity, something about outsiders not permitted in, kind of thing like that. I just thought I'd put that on the table.
Thank you, Glenn. Any other questions? I saw some hands up. Stefan Alexander?
I guess playing off on that too, because a similar thing. I was trained purely by Jewish physicists. I mean, all the way through Peskin, Susskind. I mean, like, but the thing that I found interesting about, you know, those years as I was, you know, trained as a theoretical physicist, going all the way, actually, I found out that actually I have an Einstein index, because Lee Smolin also, yeah, there's a connection to Albert Einstein, which was interesting because a lot of people don't know that Albert Einstein was also a civil rights activist. He was good friends with Paul Robeson. And so you know, we were talking about that resonance, that kind of interesting sort of creolized resonance, as my friend Louis Gordon talks about. So I think, to me, this was an interesting discussion because it brings up some personal things as well.
We have time for one or two. Denise Randall?
I just want to thank all of you all for presenting this very interesting dialogue. It's very personal to me. I can sense it's very personal to a lot of people. The suffering that we, in our culture and worldwide cultures, are suffering from this sense of tribalism. And it's really not very real to me, this tribalism. It's very, like the music has demonstrated, it is not, you can't separate these tribes from each other through the music that they play together. And it's just a hopeful prayer that I have, and a thank you to the group and this community of people who are working towards dismantling this suffering on some level.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more. Yontande?
Yeah.
Southside Cultural Center of Rhode Island.
Yeah. So I'm going to make a question of this comment. Jazz ain't nothing but soul, Betty Carter. And so I'm thinking, okay, so if Gershwin is a jazz musician and jazz ain't nothing but soul, then how can that soul not be credited in terms of where if yes he did go to a source, right? That somehow that source needs to be cited, because when you think about the practicality of things, what enables him to gain momentum and gain, success, while this other source is just this still source reservoir just waiting to be, usurped. So I'm thinking, okay, so if jazz ain't nothing but soul, is it important to source the soul that jazz is coming from?
I have a few thoughts. I'm going to try to distill everything down. Jazz comes from the collision, collaboration of two cultures that, that got put together. They got put together in a violent fashion. One of the cultures didn't want to be included. We can't talk about this without citing that. Having said that, the collision, the combination is what makes it great. Without the combination, that's the what's the word I'm looking for? Hegel. What's Hegel's name? Yes, exactly. The dialectic and the synthesis is what makes jazz. Just personal riff is Fashion Week this week. My son is working. He's much. I used to be handsome. He's handsome now. We were talking about Zara yesterday. Zara's business model is they send people with cameras into the streets of Soho and they take pictures of lit-looking people. They steal their fashions and they have them in stores in 2 weeks. This is American business. It's very lucrative. It's legal. It's not helpful to the lit people at all. So how do we, I think to riff on your thing, it's a question of how do we get past zero sum? How do we get past, okay, somebody wins and somebody loses? How do we make these things happen so that cultures can interact and it can be useful to everybody involved? I think that, that's kind of how I look at it. How do we make it so that it's a win-win? And sometimes you have to hack. I was telling Larry, I did a record a few years back that included a lot of Yoruba religious music. And there's no way I can claim, I didn't write those songs. Those songs are hundreds of years old. So I decided, okay, I'm gonna cut off a piece of this and I'll declare this as public domain and I'll send the money to the guys. I found out when you declare something as public domain, it goes into some weird pot of non-existent money. The only way I could actually pay the guys in Brazil was to put the copyright under my name. And then I did some other paperwork where it's like, okay, this percentage goes here and blah, blah, blah. And I listed it on I didn't put my name on the album. I put their name on the album. But technically, I wrote the song to Shango. Come on, So the question is, how do we get past that? So to your point.
That's that whole economic context question of how money gets divided up in the music economy, our economy in general, that complicates the whole question of how does culture evolve, because some people have the law on their side and they get the money and they own the distribution networks, and we all know that, we've all thought about this.
Can we put in, what is the topic, can we put in a plug for the organization that you're president of?
Oh, I'm also president, I'm the current president of an organization called the Content Creators Coalition, which is an artist rights organization.
And, that deals with issues of publishing and how that economy works. If I could take a minute or two, I'm just actually really touched by the questions that were asked here. And I kind of want to address some of them. I really am touched by them. First of all, to the suggestion that Gershwin was a jazz musician, I wouldn't call Gershwin a jazz musician. He really didn't improvise. He really couldn't speak in that language of improvisation that is one rudiment. And he was brilliant at composing and orchestrating around what improvisation sounds like, and that's an amazing achievement. But I don't think, and I don't even think he would have positioned himself as a jazz musician. And, if you want to play basketball, you got to be able to pass and shoot the ball. And I would just say that, even though I'm not hard and fast about my definition of jazz. The idea that there is the relationship that Melvin was talking about, that was forged out of violence and enslavement. I mean, I used to get pissed off when I hear people talk about America's classical music. This is music of this hemisphere and of an entire history that involved slave trade and this interaction. And culturally, aesthetically, musically, some amazing things have happened. But yeah, when you take apart histories of, if you want to talk about music in Portugal, you got to talk about colonialism. And if you start to understand the pieces that went together and not forget the subjugated history, but I do think that whatever we're talking about, blues, jazz, any kind of African American music, is really useful to anyone who's confused in this country about that we are culturally African American in this country. And I wrote a lot about New Orleans after the flood, and I realized that experience in New Orleans was difficult for some Americans who didn't want to look in a mirror and see blackness looking back at them. When you say, this is America. And it's happening in Puerto Rico now. But the other question I really loved was about the walls and borders, because I do think that in this moment, there's nothing as powerful as arts and culture, as powerful as idea like people that want to sit in a room and talk about ideas that are surrounding music for culture, to completely disarm those people who want to build walls. Because even the Hungarian thing, the subtext of that was a right-wing government and an aesthetic that now wants to create others and talk about that stuff. There's nothing as powerful as the music that these guys, Russ can go to Ethiopia and immediately make a connection. Melvin can go anywhere in the world and make a certain kind of connection. I remember I was writing like a decade ago about Palestinian and Israeli musicians that were funded, that were doing a project, and they went on a tour. It actually started in Morocco. They came to the US, they played the Library of Congress, and the Library of Congress objected to the fact that the word peace was in the program notes. But I remember talking to some of these guys, and they said, we want to speak to you on a level that CNN can't touch. Like, that's where we want to speak to you. And to me, it's like, people are all, how can we get around this divisiveness? How can we deal with interfaith stuff? There's nothing as potent as like what these guys do. And in a weird way, as conflicted as what Gershwin may have done, and as complicit as he may have been with certain things, he's actually provided a really strong technology to deal with some. Because actually, if you wanted to study Porgy and Bess, you have to deal with some history.
And just to kind of riff on something that popped into my head today, and talking about your analogy between, whatever, between
Jews versus.
Yeah, I mean, something I was saying, well, that we're looking at a certain time in history. I mean, we don't know if he was alive today, how he would frame his set of influences. And as I was saying earlier, I wonder how much of what we think of as, well, to frame that, I told another story talking about Dizzy Gillespie going to Scotland and going to church. And he went to church in Scotland and he started crying when they started singing because he recognized the hymns he had heard. Wow. And I wonder, thinking about Gershwin, how much of what we think of, how much of what he knew was his musical heritage he framed as African American musical heritage, and vice versa. How much of what he knew was African American heritage he framed as highbrow. And I think talking about this week, you can't take him away from his moment in history. I mean, it's like, I guess it's one of the things with me getting older now. I mean, he had the parameters that he had to work with at the time. So I have to give him credit for the places where he actually did stand up and say, hey, y'all can't mess with this. But if he was alive, that would be the question I would ask him. I'd look, that song, was that from, whose grandmother's song was that? Was that your grandmother's song, or was that, or is that James B. Johnson's grandmother's? And let's get her out here too. I think I mean, it sounded, I think that there's a few different levels here that I find interesting, you know? And it is, how do you take these things that don't really fit into the way this culture is structured and have them blossom?
I think we have time, let's see, 5 minutes? It's always a good, well,
It's
we're
not
5
like
minutes
all.
over. It's always a good sign when an event goes over and nobody's leaving the room. Let's take a couple quick questions. Nick Cardy over here, and then Kathleen over
I am a
here.
total outsider here. The only way I could get into Brown was I had to be invited and snuck in the back door. However, you gentlemen are great, I want to tell you, start off with that. But what you're just talking about, isn't that the fusion, the mix of the different cultures that if they were alive today, what would they be thinking? Because they're influenced by what's going on in the world or where they grew up. I grew up with Foggy and Bess was in our living room in a '78 album. I'm gonna go back and ask my mom if she still has it because I want, after you talking about it, I want to listen to it. But is that what you mean about the fusion? The influences that come in that influence their music?
Let's take, there was one more hand up over here.
I think mine's a quick, but maybe not. I'm just curious to know, when you say Gershwin, why it's always George and everyone forgets about Alan.
You know, I almost played,
Just let them go.
we're gonna play more music. Melvin suggested we play a great John Coltrane version of But Not For Me. And that's, first of all, he's one of the first lyricists to win the Pulitzer Prize. And that, along with many other lyrics, they're brilliant, sophisticated lyrics. No, it's not. But
yeah. We have more we could deal with in 1 hour anyway. Yeah, but, no, it's a good point.
But I wouldn't use, I don't love the word fusion. I don't go to restaurants that advertise fusion. And no, I don't love the word fusion only because I feel like what Gershwin was doing, what Ross did with his Ethiopian project, a lot of what Melvin does, we're talking about actually revealing things that were already there.
Yeah.
Where this whole hemisphere is multicultural. This, you know, we're talking about combinations that actually were there, and not, you know, it's not. We're not fusing a 3-beat and a 4-beat. The 3-beat and the 4-beat were already together. We're just revealing it.
There's so many connections between the African music and South American, Latin American music and North American music because of the diaspora, the African diaspora, that if you're serious at all as an American musician, it's part of you, it's gotta be part of your DNA. And a Latin musician, so there is that underlying language that always seems to connect for me with people from Africa or Latinos that I play with.
I find that in this moment, rather than going to march or a protest, I go to culture. And to me, like I was saying before, culture is the best argument against fundamentalism and against the idea of purity. And I found any advanced, any musician or poet or artist or thinker that I've really dealt with and have been lucky to in my work has taught me that none of these things are pure, all of them are complicated, and if you think that you fund any, you know, I mean, the problem that Wynton Marsalis introduced into the jazz world was not stylistic, it was a fundamentalist attitude.
I mean, it's interesting just kind of riffing on this conversation, just thinking about, you know, I'm a bit thinking out loud here, so just excuse me. I mean, thinking about how Gershwin decided to deal with his own issues. I mean, he changed his name, you know, I mean, it's, and then thinking about it from a standpoint for me, from the Gullah side of my family, I mean, somebody else changed their name, and I just thinking growing up, you know, they're sort of relentlessly held on to what they had, you know, and they still speak that, you know, they still held on from words that people spoke 200 years ago, whatever. It's this interesting clash, and just, but the thing that's, I guess, I'm making this personal to you, just thinking out loud a little bit. My Gullah family is the most open, they're the most open-minded set of people I know. My cousin is, she's a Jehovah's Witness, which would make you not think she's open-minded, but she's sick now, but when I was a kid, I go visit her, there would be people from Europe sleeping on the floor, some people from Korea. She was like, trained other people at how to go be a Jehovah's Witness. That was her, right? I wonder, again, talking about the thesis antithesis, I wonder if having that strength of culture is what allows you to be open, I'm just kind of throwing that out there. It's just a thought. I mean, but having, I think rounding this out, yes, it is the synthesis that makes the unique thing, that makes the thing worth talking about. But I guess looking at it from the side of the person, of the culture that gets erased, when the synthesis happens, it becomes problematic.
Right. Especially when you've been left with nothing but your culture. You take an economic advantage of systematically for, forever. That's the thing of value, especially.
Well, I'd vote for the honorary degrees for all three of you.
Thank yous, although I'll let Richard plug the
Don't forget
concert.
the Gershwin Songbook event on February 22nd at the Vets that FirstWorks is putting on. It'll be very interesting.
I just wanted to say I'm really honored by this conversation, by you all leaping in, by Richard from being his brainchild, and our mission is connecting art with audiences, and this kind of spark of where you investigate what seems like a concert by tickets that really is a deeper idea that's been set in motion. So thank you, Richard, Larry, Melvin.